Mr. Speaker, let's not forget the National Skills Development Center, or as we know, NSDC. They were designed to provide skills and training for our citizens. So I ask the government, through you, Mr. Speaker, how much money has the government pumped into NSDC to help improve and expand the number of skills training that is being offered at NSDC? Has there been an increase in the budget? And if not, clearly, Mr. Speaker, even a blind man can see that this government is saying one thing in this motion, but is doing something entirely different. And so again, I ask, why now? Is it because education reform is something that will include us in global conversation, and so they bring this motion to this honorable house today? Mr. Speaker, I wish to refer to the Prime Minister, the Honorable Alan Shastny, in his 2018-2019 budget address. According to the Honorable Shastny, under economic development and skills learning, he referenced the developmental growth in China and how skills learning and training heavily contributed to that. And if I may quote Mr. Speaker, he said, "The lessons to be learned is that we must prepare our people for jobs that we know will become available over the next few years. Hence, the Ministry of Education is embarking on a new thrust in TVET and CVQ certification in hospitality studies, culinary arts, spa and wellness investment services, and construction techniques," end quote. Now, Mr. Speaker, as we see, this statement was made over 2 fiscal years ago, and we are now approaching a new fiscal year. Yet, the government only today seeks to bring this motion to debate a more diverse program when the need for one was brought to a realization over 2 years ago. So, Mr. Speaker, why now? It seems our government was still asleep. Mr. Speaker, while we agree that reforming the education system is important, I believe we must place emphasis on some important areas that should be a part of the discussion. Yes, Mr. Speaker, TVET, CVQs, and other novelty ideas on education and skills development are important. It is all well and good for the government to stand up here and beat their chests and sound off their trumpets in the call for education reform. However, Mr. Speaker, accessibility must be an important part of the discussion. According to the Education Act, every school-age student who resides in the state must be enrolled in an educational institution. This is enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of a Child, and universal education demands it. Mr. Speaker, however, it bleeds my heart to know that that children today are unable to attend school because their parents do not have the means to send them, and as a result, the streets become the safe haven. Mr. Speaker, I call on this government to ensure that as part of the reform, measures must be put in place to ensure every St. Lucian child has an access to take advantage of their right to an education. Yes, Mr. Speaker, it seems passion has me parched. Mr. Speaker, I beg to quote the research findings on the impacts of instability in the home by the United Nations. Children's early experiences shape who they are and affect lifelong health and learning. To develop to their full potential, children need safe and stable housing, adequate and nutritious food, access to medical care, secure relationships with adult caregivers, nurturing and responsive parenting, and high-quality learning at home and in childcare settings and in school, end quote. Mr. Speaker, broken homes is a reality, and it has a negative impact on our children. I see it every day, Mr. Speaker, even in my own constituency. And so we need to provide the best, and so we can provide the best education ever. But if it is not accessible, then it will be an exercise in futility. Mr. Speaker, I must commend the Anglican schools on their approach to offering to their parents in partnership with the PTA, training of course. Working with our parents is important, and reform should include them because it takes more than just changing the curriculum to empower our youth. Mr. Speaker, the key point to education reform is not just changing the curriculum. It is involving the parents to empower the youth. Mr. Speaker, the learning capabilities of students must be considered. Our differently abled children has to be part of this plan, leaving no one behind. And the Honorable Member for Babuno stressed on that extensively. Mr. Speaker, I would like to refer to the motion, the original motion that we had, and its call for systematic change. I asked the government to elaborate on the plans for implementing this process. I wish to point out that in order to achieve systematic change, social change is also necessary. Critical to systematic changes and reform is the consolidation of our efforts. This requires the breaking down of barriers and bridging of gaps. We need the parents, students, teachers, private sector, and both governmental and non-governmental agencies involved. We need all hands on deck. No buiser tout le monde pour venir à somme. Mr. Speaker, allow me to zero in on the private sector for a moment. The private sector and its involvement in education reform is one of the utmost importance. The Ministry of Education and the government in its entirety needs to have in place, and Mr. Speaker, I stress on this need, it must be mandatory, may I even say, that the government liaises and works with the private sector to allow for opportunities to be made available and to be capitalized by those graduating from the TVET program, which they so highly praise. We must also ensure that students are not only equipped with skills that make them simply employable, and of course, Mr. Speaker, employability is a good thing. However, the consolidation in the private sector must allow for these skills to be effectively translated not only in today's world, but the future. Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that we continue to be interested in skills training in only low-end jobs such as service industry and construction industry. But what about the skills training in the field of information technology? We are not talking about training institutions to teach our children. And I mean all of them: coding, the creation of apps and robotics, the training of artificial intelligence, and all these new areas of innovation. Where is the vision and creativity of the government, Mr. Speaker? This is where the world is heading.
Honourable Prime Minister, Member for Castres North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe the member for Beaufort North is slightly misleading the House in the sense that the member imputes that the government is not engaging private sector institutions in our quest to implement TVET. Mr. Speaker, part of the CVQ qualification and allows for whoever is pursuing that qualification to be enrolled and acquire some industrial experience prior to gaining that certification, Mr. Speaker. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, in respect to the IT aspect of it, our National Skills Development Center has decided to offer computer systems, which is CompTIA A+, which is an international certification by our NSDC Center in the Bize, in the area of Bize Castres. And the NSDC is also looking into implementing mobile-first website development. So the government does have the idea of inculcating ICT and other technological programs in its pursuit, Mr. Speaker. So I wanted to clarify that.
Thank you, Honourable Prime Minister and Member for Castres North. Member for Beaufort North, you asked for clarification on your last point regarding the inclusion of private agencies.
Mr. Speaker, I did not say that the government is not including the private sector. So, Honorable Prime Minister, thank you for trying really hard, but you did not fool me off my game. Mr. Speaker, this is where the world is heading, and we must, I insist, we must prepare our children for this future. And Mr. Speaker, who better to drive that initiative but a partnership between the government and the private sector? Mr. Speaker, Not only is it necessary for the private sector to provide such opportunities, but the government and all its agencies should also have a plan of action as to the graduates from this TVET program. And I propose government-funded jobs and opportunities in the initial stages. Mr. Speaker, proper management and efficiency of the education sector has a priority. Modern classrooms that are safe for our students and conducive to their learning. Our teachers must be properly trained and equipped with modern skills to engage our students and facilitate their development. This should include the improvement of our teacher education unit. Mr. Speaker, as I come to a close, I would like to say that a healthy, productive, youthful population is the stimuli for economic development after education reform. According to Oxford, and may I quote Mr. Speaker, of course, education in every sense is one of the fundamental factors of development. No country can achieve sustainable economic development without substantial investment in human capital. Education enriches people, understanding of themselves and the world. It improves the quality of their lives and leads to broad social benefits to individuals and society. Education raises people's productivity, creativity, and promotes entrepreneurship and technological advances. Education is also an important contributor to technological capability and technical change in industry. End quote. Mr. Speaker, while I believe that this motion needs to be reviewed and more work should be done into painting a clearer picture as to the government's intervention and plan for educational and systematic reforms, I would not go down in history as the member who opposed educational reform, which we can all agree is important for the development of our country at this time. I beg that the government introduce other motions that will support this one in an effort to advance educational reforms to strengthen our approaches in the sector. I owe it to my constituents, Mr. Speaker, to represent their best interests, and educational reform does just that. I thank you.
Thank you, Member for Vieux-Fort North. Member for Denby North and Minister for Health and Wellness.
Can I get it? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I bid a splendid afternoon to my fellow cabinet colleagues and by extension, the opposition. It gives me great pleasure to commemorate yet another independence. Toast to 41 years of advancement. Mr. Speaker, firstly, I feel obliged to recognize the notable progress of my constituents regarding health. While some persons are seen riding their bicycles tirelessly within my community, others indulge in early morning and afternoon walks. Mr. Speaker, allow me to make mention of the rivalry among the football teams in Denby North. The Monarch Club captured a spectacular victory of 2 goals against Richfordshire in the recent football match. This is no surprise due to their consistent winning streak. Mr. Speaker, Denby North has individuals who are quite ambitious and they possess stamina and endurance, which are key contributors to these health practices. Returning to the topic at hand, Mr. Speaker, I rise in full support of the motion laid by the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, in our conception, basic education is an integral part of being a healthy person. The TVET program combines a range of skills such as literacy, numeracy, citizenship, and social interaction to create an overall healthy individual. These embody personal capacities and the products of formal education, including learning experiences, are comparable to physical capacities of fitness. As commonly known, fitness is a component of health. Education teaches a person to use his or her mind, learning, thinking, reasoning, and solving problems, and so on, are mental exercises which keeps the central nervous system in shape, just as physical exercise keeps the body in shape. Mr. Speaker, health encompasses the mental attributes of individuals. Crippling afflictions of depression and anxiety, panic attacks, and low self-esteem affect students during examination time. Consequently, students underperform on these crucial tests. This highlights the central thesis of this NYC government, that examinations are not reflective of students' potential, and abolishment of these exams are necessary, common entrance being no different. Therefore, a person who is unhealthy is unable to conduct himself or herself effectively to achieve some level of social well-being. This is a critical element of the World Health Organization conception of health, which recognizes the contribution of educational skills beyond the health sector of promoting health. Mr. Speaker and fellow members, do you recall when we came home from school and played outside? When girls played games such as hopscotch and Chinese skip? While the boys usually played marbles, or we collectively went for river baths and jumped in the baths. These kept us physically active. Mr. Speaker, gone are the days when children climbed trees for fruits like mangoes, when fast food was just a treat, and soft drinks came in really small round bottles. Things have changed in recent decades. Serving sizes have expanded with waistlines, and many children stay indoors, watching television or playing computer games. Mr. Speaker, health is a prerequisite for education. In 2004, an American non-profit organization called Action for Healthy Kids released a special report identifying the link among the factors of poor nutrition, inactivity, and academic achievement. The relationship was based on substantial research. Well-nourished students tend to be better performing students, whereas poorly nourished students tend to demonstrate weaker academic performance and score lower on tests. The majority of St. Lucian students are not eating a balanced, nutrient-rich diet. Inadequate consumption of key groups deprives children of essential vitamins, minerals, fats, and proteins necessary for optimum cognitive function. Nutrition affecting academic achievement comes as no revelation, as our parents often nag us to mention something quickly morning time, despite being tardy. What is, however, surprising is that physical activity positively affects performance. The National Association for Sports and Physical Education for Children in 2001 stated that students who participated in daily physical education exhibited better attendance and a more positive attitude towards school and performed exceptionally in academics. Educational reform can be a powerful catalyst for change when it comes to preventing and reducing overweight and obesity. The forming of a health advisory council where principals engage volunteers such as parents, students, and medical professionals can help conceive and implement nutritional education programs. Teachers can start class with fun aerobic or dancing and can incorporate nutrition and physical activity into reading, math, and other subjects. Mr. Speaker, St. Lucia has the highest registered diabetic prevalence rate per head of population in the entire Organization of Eastern Caribbean States and the world. According to the World Health Organization figures for the year 2000, St. Lucia had an average of 5,000 registered diabetics, estimated to reach 11,000 by 2030. St. Kitts and Nevis had 2,000, with that figure estimated to remain the same in 2030. Antigua, Barbuda, and Dominica each had 3,000, with Dominica estimated to be 4,000 and Antigua and Barbuda 5,000 respectively for 2030. St. Vincent and the Grenadines had 5,000, with 11,000 estimated by 2030. These figures were widely published, but obviously no proactive measures were taken to reduce the statistics. 7 years later, by April of 2007, St. Lucia was diagnosed as the deepest in the global diabetic danger zone, with the highest rate of diabetics prevalence in the world. The diagnosis was proven by a scientific study conducted by Dr. Michael Graven, who is a Canadian researcher and neurologist who screened more than 31,000 St. Lucians and summarized that the state of diabetes in St. Lucia is tantamount to a public health disaster, much like a hurricane with catastrophic rates. The study found that based on the then trend, the rate of new cases of diabetes would double every 4 years and hypertension every 5 years, with complications of heart attacks, strokes, renal failure, blindness, and amputations burdening the health system. It also indicated that 8.1% of the population was diabetic. Mr. Speaker, through the reformation of the educational agriculture sector, techniques such as hydroponics and aquaponics, permaculture, and biodynamic farming will be introduced to students. Eating of local foods reduces blood pressure and diabetes risk, given the reduced preservatives, artificial flavorings, and other ingredients used to preserve the freshness of food over time. A study published in Diabetes and Metabolism examined 159 healthy volunteers split into groups. Both groups maintained their regular diet with one key difference. One group purchased their foods from local owners who did not use additives in processing, while others purchased items found at the supermarket. The study performed a baseline measurement and another after 6 months. Researchers measured weight, blood pressure, sodium and potassium, insulin, and fasting glucose. The group which consumed locally sourced foods showed a lower systolic blood pressure after 6 months. They also displayed lower fasting glucose levels than those who ate food sourced from supermarkets. Mr. Speaker, with an annual food import bill of $4.5 million, employing these new techniques will reduce this bill and significantly decrease the transmission of diseases such as salmonella infection and norovirus. Mr. Speaker, as Minister of Health and Wellness, I'm advocating that we all work together to combat this epidemic which is plaguing our beautiful island. I am hoping that next year around this time, when we will be celebrating our 42nd anniversary of independence, there will be tremendous progress when it comes to health, as independence should not primarily focus on the raising of a flag or the singing of an anthem. It is fundamental that we work significantly with our youth, for they are the future of tomorrow. A healthy people is a healthy nation. Mr. Speaker, I envision that educational reform will generate monumental changes within the health sector of St. Lucia. Thank you.
Thank you, member. Member for Castries Southeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon to everyone that is present here today. It is indeed a pleasure to represent the vibrant people of Castries Southeast and to represent the youth of such constituency. Mr. Speaker, before I begin my presentation on the motion, I'd like to make a special note of two very important people. It is Myra Serrier, who recently took part in the court's OECS reading competition, Although she did not take first place, she did take second, and it just goes to show how well our education system can function if well taken care of. Also, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make another mention of Mr. John G. Paul of Bexar, who for the season 2020 will be representing us in France as he's going to become a professional basketballer. So I hope that all members will support me in congratulating the both of them for their achievements. Mr. Speaker, I'd first like to state that I am in full support of the motion. Educational reform is good for every single one of us here. But Mr. Speaker, what I would also like to emphasize is that everything needs to be done properly, especially something as important as the education of the youth. One oversight could lead to unwanted results. And Mr. Speaker, allow me to say something in Creole. Si ou ka fey bon. If you're doing it, do it well. Mr. Speaker, as a current student myself, I can understand the government's argument that now is a good time for us to implement technical and vocational training at the various levels of education. As a student of Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, I sometimes ponder and realize that skills training is sorely needed at the institution. It is one thing to constantly see writing on a board, but it is another to actually practice and put into works the things that you have learned over a period of time. And Mr. Speaker, one example for this personally is at Sir Arthur, I am a computer systems engineering student. I do electricity at the associate degree level. And Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, if my breaker was to trip right now, I would not know anything about that, Mr. Speaker. I would have to consult somebody that never went to an institution of such a high level. So clearly there is something wrong in our education system, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, as much as technical and vocational education and skills can be important in the short term, Mr. Speaker, it can make our education system more dynamic, but it on its own will not fix the shortcomings of our education system of the last few decades, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to make an analogy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if you have a car and the car's battery and its engine is non-functional, Mr. Speaker, it refuses to drive. Painting the car in a new color will not make it drive, Mr. Speaker. So by implementing this new system, it will not on its own fix the problems of our education system and our society in more general. Mr. Speaker, what will mitigate some of these problems is a holistic approach that we must take to our education system, and that doesn't only include the schools. It starts in the homes, in our society, and in all of our institutions, Mr. Speaker. Also, Mr. Speaker, in doing some of my duties as a youth parliamentarian, over the last couple of months, I decided to take a little walk, a little bus ride down to the constituency. I went to the Bexar Primary School. Mr. Speaker, I was very open-minded, I should say, with going in with good expectations. But Mr. Speaker, it was not very pleasing to see some of the conditions that some of these students and teachers have to be spending most of the time that their eyes are open in, Mr. Speaker. I put myself in their shoes, Mr. Speaker. How would I feel having to come to work there all the time, Mr. Speaker? And it begs the question, Mr. Speaker, how can teachers working in such environments be able to give students their best? Does that in itself make the best of our education system, Mr. Speaker? And also, Mr. Speaker, will changing the system change any of that? It will not, Mr. Speaker. It's the same thing painting the car, Mr. Speaker. We have to fix the engine first. Mr. Speaker, it was with great disheartenment as a computer student, as I mentioned, to find out that the computer lab at the Bexar Primary School had not been taken care of and has no computer teacher for 4 years now, Mr. Speaker. How are these students to be computer literate, Mr. Speaker, if we do not implement these measures in the school? And Mr. Speaker, I do be reminded that these teachers have to spend 5 days a week at these institutions, Mr. Speaker. So my question is, Mr. Speaker, what plans do the government have in place to ensure that the reformation of the education system takes care of situations like this, Mr. Speaker? Or is it going to be another oversight on their part, Mr. Speaker? Or does that not matter? Because, Mr. Speaker, things like that certainly have an impact. Surely, we must realize that unless the necessary measures are taken, this undertaking will either not live up to its capabilities or will be completely futile, Mr. Speaker. Imagine for a second, if you would, Mr. Speaker, that the education system was changed, and then right after that happened, Mr. Speaker, some of the institutions themselves structurally were to fall down, Mr. Speaker. At that point, would it not all be in vain, Mr. Speaker? The government wants to put the cat before the horse, Mr. Speaker. We cannot do that, Mr. Speaker. Everything has to be done in time, Mr. Speaker. You cannot put three before one. Now, Mr. Speaker, what happens if all some of the institutions were to fall down after the education system change, Mr. Speaker? What then? Will it be a successful undertaking? I would like to know, Mr. Speaker. Also, given that tourism, aside from other industries, makes the largest contribution to the GDP, it's necessary that we seek to reform the education system so as to sustain growth of the industry and prepare our students to capitalize on the emerging employment and training opportunities, Mr. Speaker. As the tourism industry develops, the demand for more efficient services will increase. Thus, in considering educational reform, we must propose changes in the sector which will see students well prepared to qualify for the emerging opportunities, Mr. Speaker. The creation of a hospitality academy, which offers CSEC subjects to students, nonetheless, with a focus on core competencies within the hospitality sector, will advance the development of students with this interest. The academy will provide programs at an intermediary level to SACI's hospitality department and bring students a step closer to realizing their passions. What I do believe, Mr. Speaker, would be a good initiative is that the Citizenship by Investment Program funds that are allocated towards, allocated towards the upgrading of school technological infrastructure for the modern classrooms to enhance the learner experience. At present, given the current CIP legislation, most funds are allocated towards the development of civil infrastructure by Invest St. Lucia. However, a shift in policy focus, will allow for similar investments to be made into technological advancements for learners at the first to third form level. Mr. Speaker, a great example of this would be the Antiguan government's use of the CIP funds to create a solar power plant at the VC Bird International Airport. This plant contains 12,000 solar panels which generate 3 megawatt peak and up to 4,645 megawatt hours of solar energy a year. Mr. Speaker, also, Cabinet determines the number of island scholarships towards the scholarship awards to be given per year. And for the past few years, the scholarship awards to the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College Division of Technical Education and Management Studies to pursue only undergraduate studies as of 2002 is only awarded to one student of that division. Whilst the St. Lucia Island Scholarship Award through the Education Act makes a provision for the Division of Arts, Science and General Studies is only 1 to 2 persons of that division. If we are speaking of a level playing field, Mr. Speaker, we should be offering this scholarship to our top performers across all divisions, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I'd like to emphasize that we need strong, mindful leaders to speak often about the perils of trying to do too much, too fast, and on the cheap, Mr. Speaker. Especially not with our education system, Mr. Speaker. The discourse about what the country needs from its education system needs rebalancing and grounding in what clear-minded captains of the industry have learned from their experiences and what the educational examination shows matters to preparing people for a self-sufficient, civically responsible, and personally satisfying life. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Castries Southeast. Member for Labrie and Minister for Tourism, Commerce and Consumer Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise in this Parliament to add my voice to the motion proposed, where the youth of the country, as the next generation leaders, have seen the need for implementing reforms in the educational sector that will provide modernized skills training at the various levels of education. Now, given the fact that we youth are the ones responsible for the near future, I believe it is imperative that we take all stands in favor of nurturing them. Already, as can be seen, young people are involved in almost every aspect of society and have a part to play in most areas nowadays. It is only a shame, Mr. Speaker, that the worst examples which come to mind when the word youth is mentioned is that it is judged only by a percentage of its population, only by those who choose to make the wrong decisions. But with the introduction of educational reform, we can hope a change for the better, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I realize that much emphasis has been placed on the infrastructure of schools. But I need us to realize, Mr. Speaker, that regardless, the show must go on. The CXC examinations must still be written, regardless. Those students who are interested in their own good will, under any circumstance, make it their priority that they will make it out on top. I, Mr. Speaker, have been in such a situation. Just a few years ago, the Choiseul Secondary School had been underneath renovations. However, that did not deter us from completing our courses and writing the CXC examination, even
At the time, Ms. Kira De Freitas topped the island in the CXC examinations. Mr. Speaker, continuing, too often do we have dropouts from schools, underperforming students, as well as those who unfortunately couldn't make it past the academic standards of society, failing to achieve the definition of successful. These are people with potential and talent which was not developed, like a flower in the bud, but just getting ready to bloom. There is nothing better I like to see than when a young person makes strides where their own good is concerned. And this, Mr. Speaker, let me bring you to my community for just a while. I would like to recognize Jaime Ferdinand, the young man from the Chozel Secondary School, for representing St. Lucia at the NACA Games in El Salvador. His excellent performance not only made his parents proud, but his entire constituency on the whole. Now, reform in light of exams and differently abled students have been addressed by my former colleagues, so I do not wish to stress too much on these areas. I want to speak today to you on the big picture. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm here to present on educational reform within the tourism sector. Now, tourism, as we may know it, accounts for 65% of GDP, and it's the St. Lucia's main source of foreign exchange earnings. Thus, this industry's valuable nature must be tenderly nurtured by the government of the country and its people. It is unfortunate, however, that more is not done to promote greater growth and development in this area. Particularly, hospitality education is extremely limited, resulting in a small representative number of population taking on qualified opportunities in this industry. So today I want to examine a variety of applicable reforms which should be implemented in our education system that will enable the population as a whole to truly appreciate the essential nature of the tourism industry to our island. So, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I would like to temporarily draw your attention to the unemployed population in St. Lucia. Now, the unemployed population in St. Lucia comprises of two main groups. We have those which are overqualified and we have those which are underqualified. The overqualified ones are those who contribute majorly to the brain drain, which we have a problem with in St. Lucia. Now, due to the emphasis placed on the mainstream subjects in schools, such as the science, the math, math and English is important, but the mainstream subjects, we have many people going for the mainstream jobs, quote unquote, like you have the lawyer, like my minister said before me. People wanting to become, I want to become a lawyer, I want to become a teacher, I want to become an accountant. And recently we have many people wanting to become doctors. That is not the problem, Mr. Speaker, don't get me wrong. But everybody cannot be a lawyer, everybody cannot be a teacher, everybody cannot be an accountant. Like she said before me once again, my colleague, we need those who will provide the food for us, provide the fish for us. Now, you have these people going at great lengths to attain the degrees in the different areas, and on coming back, they are overqualified for the jobs available. So those who are persistent, they leave the country, brain drain. On the other hand, Mr. Speaker, we have those who are underqualified for the jobs available. Yes, they are underqualified for the jobs available. They did not make it past society's academic standards and are unable to be employed. So what can be done to alleviate the situation? So what good is educational reform in light of tourism? I present to you, Mr. Speaker, entrepreneurship. Yes. Now, like I previously mentioned, Mr. Speaker, our economy's mainstay is tourism. So why not educate our youth in light of tourism in this specific sector? Now, we humans, what we do is that we usually view tourism in only one direction, through a tunnel scope. But we have to realize that tourism is very broad. It has a wide range. For example, indirectly, we can have the farmers producing various crops, and instead of having the hotels importing food from other countries, we can have them purchasing local produced from the farmers. Yes, a few of our hotels do purchase food from our local farmers, however, not on a very wide scale. Too often, Mr. Speaker, we have people heavily depending on the government for job provision. Too many people are be crying out, the government, I need a job. Well, I mean, yes, the government encourages entrepreneurship by offering financial aid to the upstarts. However, Mr. Speaker, as I recently learned, a great percentage of the businesses do not last, as the individuals lack the skills and they lack the persistence. So, in light of educational reform, what I propose, Mr. Speaker, is that from early as primary school, our students be taught what it takes to run things on their own, the expertise it requires, the knowledge it takes, and the timely effort it demands. Note, I didn't say that they're not taught to run a business, but to run things on their own. Not to be too independent, but independent. You get me? Truly, Mr. Speaker, entrepreneurship is a literal subject offered at the A-level institution. However, why is it that such is provided only after the student has written the CXC examinations? The CSEC examinations serve as the basis and as the springboard into the world of work. So I propose, Mr. Speaker, that entrepreneurship, the entire subject, the entire theme of entrepreneurship be introduced as early as primary school. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, if I bring it closer to home, it will enlighten my point. From the review section of TripAdvisor, I quote, "You can't visit Labri and not dine at Mama Tilly's. She is a Labri institution and a very lovely woman." End quote. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is just one of the many reviews on the renowned TripAdvisor platform coming from one of the many satisfied tourist customers of a small restaurant named Mama Tilly's, which is located in Labri. Having successfully made it on the international tourist platforms, individuals who come to the best beach in the south, which is the Labri, by the way, usually stop for a bite at a place. Now, can we get more businesses like this on the international platform, on the international market? Why not? Of course, with the right training provided. We must realize, Mr. Speaker, that the simple sea, sun, and sun no longer serves as the main purpose for travel. Modern tourists crave for new things. Yes, we still have the need for excitement like the ziplining, but one of the most recent and prominent is the desire to experience one's culture, to be immersed in what would be our daily lives and the things which will hold dear to us. The Airbnb, Air Breakfast and Bread, has taken hold of that observation and run with it. So right now, currently in Labri, many of the locally styled guest houses serve as a much attractive alternative to the hotels, right? Some examples are Chalet, Lamar, Bellevue Apartments, and the Labri Zandoli House. Now, if we can usher in more entrepreneurs like this into the private sector, we will be picking two mangoes with one stone. We don't do killing in the parliament. This will firstly alleviate the problem of high unemployment rates among our youths. Those who are starting the businesses will be employing those who don't choose to start a business, because entrepreneurship, I understand, is not for everybody. And secondly, tax. A higher percentage of successful entrepreneurs can and will definitely raise the country's GDP, which in turn will improve our standard of living. And let me just outstep my boundary just a little bit to say that with a higher GDP, not only we will have the roads being fixed and the much needed infrastructure being taken care of. Now, moving on, Mr. Speaker, the main barrier for qualified youths in getting a job is the lack of experience. All the time. 2 years, 3 years, frustrating. I myself am a victim. The minister, or should I say the honorable member for Soufrière, she asked for the institution to boost the hospitality morale. I have it there for you. Hence, I propose the students gain experience by working where they learn, rather to go to work while still attending school. This idea, Mr. Speaker, is neither fictional, and I admit it's neither original, because this institution, exists in Mario, Denver, in America, in America, full stop. The name is Spring Hill suits, and it's a hotel. Not just your ordinary hotel, but a hotel run by students. Well, it's not literally run by the students, but a great percentage of the staff body are comprised of students who are pursuing careers in the hospitality sector. This is the optimum learning.
Honorable Member, you have 3 minutes to conclude your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Castries South and Minister for Education.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to invoke Standing Order 3210 to allow the Honourable Member an additional 5 minutes to conclude his presentation.
Honorable Members, the question is that the member be granted an additional 5 minutes to conclude his presentation. I now put the question. As many as of that opinion, say aye. Aye. As many as of the contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honorable Member for Labrie, you have additional 5 minutes to conclude your presentation. You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, so picking up from where I left off. So this is the optimum learning environment, and it's an environment that any one student could wish for because the level of involvement is at its peak. The students are offered the theory part of the course alongside the practical aspect. Now in this real-time work environment, all that time spent is regarded as work experience time. So that tall barrier for the new starters is being taken care of. Sam Banini, a restaurant manager, says, and I quote, "Most of our students work in the industry already, combining their on-the-job experience with relevant classroom experience, assuring that they graduate with a personal and deep understanding of the industry, its demands, and the importance of hard work." End of quote. A student says, and I quote, "My education is giving me all the tools and experience I need to be a successful manager and hotelier." End quote. While yes, Mr. Speaker, just recently Monroe College began providing hospitality courses for our local youths, the problem of lack of experience is still a burden. I hereby propose such a change, Mr. Speaker, more specifically this one for the tertiary education section in our country. You know, the best part of it all, Mr. Speaker, the part I love the most is that it does not require constant financial support from the government, for it is self-sustainable. The institution is a real-time business with real-time tourists and real-time foreign exchange. Certain schools, Mr. Speaker, like the Viewfort Comprehensive, offer pretty diverse subjects, auto mechanics, electricity, you name it. However, the sit-in-class format and cram for exam is still the same. And as my colleague mentioned before, this does not work in favor of everybody. Hence, I have the glory of the work and learn institution proposed. Now, instead of the same hotel setup which you are so familiar with, why not capitalize on providing authentic cultural experience? Say no to the macaroni and cheese and introduce things like the potato, the bouillon, and the deshine. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I would like to re-emphasize the importance of educational reform in light of tourism, since the tourism industry is what contributes to majority of our country's income. Mr. Speaker, not every unemployed individual may have what it takes to be an entrepreneur. Nor will every student want to be a worker of the hospitality sector. That's okay, I understand. But if, Mr. Speaker, this reform will bless the lives of 30%, just 30% of this unemployed population, I believe every step should be taken in assisting them. Why is it, a person might ask, that students cheat on exams? That's an interesting question, right? It's because society values grades over their learning. Mr. Speaker, the essence of governance is very much like a relay. The role is passed from generation to generation. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, that my generation is ready to take that baton. I thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Member for Dennery South.
Mr. Speaker, I rise commending you for your stern leadership. I thank you for the opportunity afforded to me here today. And I'm hopeful that the ideas shared in this Parliament could resonate with the people of St. Lucia in the interest of their future and the future of their children. I am a proud son of the soil of the constituency, well, majestic constituency of Dennery South, but moreover, that this constituency encapsulates, carries the spirit of a people who are diligent, conscientious, and hardworking, Mr. Speaker. Yes, Dennery South, happy 41st Independence Anniversary. St. Lucia, happy 41st Independence Anniversary. The core principle of my constituency has remained embedded in the belief that education is the basis for personal development. Education, for the most, has enabled many of this constituency to prosper and move up the economic ladders, Mr. Speaker. Although there is much work to be done, don't get me wrong. Extreme poverty has been abated through education. We, the members of this honorable side of the House of Parliament of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, along with the people emanating from the beacon of the East, Dennery South, stand in support of the theory of education reform. Listen well. We realize to remain relevant in this ever-changing global community, we would need to change, Mr. Speaker. That is obvious. We need to remain relevant in anything that we do. So we need to take that home, okay? To you, Mr. Speaker, please allow me to place confidence in the Ministry of Education being the entity responsible for and given the opportunity through this motion to forego, hopefully, a new era of education in St. Lucia. It is my belief that with feasible scope, much consultation, which Mr. Speaker has not been happening here today, and diverse groupthink, we could make this reform a reality if we really and truly want reform. The opposition is ready. We have always been ready. We are here. We're missing one member is because he cannot come. Okay, so we're here. We're all ears. I am happy that the members on the other side, Mr. Speaker, spoke of CVQ and other parts of their recommendations because it all sounds nice on paper. Everything sounds nice on paper, Mr. Speaker, but when it comes to implementation, that's a different show.
That's right.
Okay? My concerns remain the aspect of implementation again and scope of this project. We need to be clear and concise when asking agencies whether it is make it be the Ministry of Education or others to act on our behalf, Mr.
Point
Speaker.
of order.
Member for Cashville South and Minister for Education.
Mr. Speaker, the honorable member is misleading this honorable House, Mr. Speaker. It is proven here, and I could make it a document of the House, that this is not just on paper. It is implemented from the National Skills Development Center. And Mr. Speaker, I beg that the member opposite withdraws his statement, Mr. Speaker, because that is misleading the House, very untruthful, Mr. Speaker. He's mendacious in his statements, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Dennery South, I believe you stand corrected, and I ask that you withdraw your statement.
Mr. Speaker, I rise speaking to the minister, the member for Cashville South, saying that I spoke in general. I did not say specifically this piece of legislation. I'm saying in general, when we look at the way things are implemented in this country, Mr. Speaker, we basically put things on paper for it to look nice, and when it comes to application, they sit in the halls of the Ministry of Education.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order again.
Member for Castries South and Minister for Education.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order again. The honorable member is misleading the House. This is done at the National Skills Development Center. I could make it a document of the House so that everybody could see, you know. This here is right, but he's saying that it's about
Members of the opposition, thank you.
At the National Skills Development Center. It's right there. It's right there.
Members of the opposition.
It's right there. It has been implemented. Let's not speak in general about it. You mentioned
Mr.
it.
Speaker,
Thank you,
Thank you,
Honourable
Mr.
Member for Castries South.
Mr. Speaker, I was making a general assertion. So I think the Minister...
Member.
Yes.
Member for Babono. Member for Babono. I was not aware that you were signed all of Speaker of the House today. Order, members, order. Order, please.
May I continue, Mr. Speaker?
Member for Delray South. I will allow you to continue.
Mr. Speaker, it is my hopes that when I do need extra time, that the member for Castries South...
Member for Delray South, I ask that you please continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We touch on the aspect of wanting TVET to be administered in our curriculum, Mr. Speaker, or be inculcated into the curriculum, Mr. Speaker. And the revamping, or one may even say the abolition of the common entrance exam. The need for more skilled, youthful workforce. It was also mentioned, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I am still left wondering, who exactly are we targeting? Are we targeting the primary school level students? Are we targeting infant school? Are we targeting secondary schools? Mr. Speaker, is it a mixture? What about the young people who are already unemployed? Or those who are currently sitting at our premier tertiary institution, South Louis Community College? What are we doing here, Mr. Speaker? Because these cross segments are of dire need of attention. These groups, these classifications of individuals, Mr. Speaker, they all need some level of attention. I can think of the secondary school, which has been mentioned a lot here today, Mr. Speaker, that obviously we need continuous assessment, that when those students reach at the level of CXC and CVQ, which we were trying to implement, Mr. Speaker, they are ready. I can think of the primary school level, Mr. Speaker, where when those students are in primary school, we have guidance counselors, we have people who can assess those students' mental and know how to fit them in or guide them along, Mr. Speaker. I can think of the infant school where these children are just starting and you need to find how they work and put them into the right classification and classes, Mr. Speaker, to help aid them. We need to remember, Mr. Speaker, that education should be about the youth of our country. Education needs to be about the person. That has come out and it's about exams and all this. Mr. Speaker, education is about the youth, the children. This is the future of our country we're playing with here, Mr. Speaker. And when we come and we bring these legislations in here, we have to be serious. We need to engage. We need to engage. We need to engage, Mr. Speaker. And you may say, yeah, that's why we're here, but I don't feel engaged, Mr. Speaker. And our side don't feel engaged because when the member for Babono was speaking, he was cut off. So this is not engagement, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me also say, the business community needs to be engaged because we are in part and parcel preparing students to be in the business world, to be ready to take on the mantle of tomorrow, to be paying our bills that we are putting on their backs today, to be the ones in place of us so that they can help with the NIC and all these different things. So we need to get the students ready for the work life, whether it be as an entrepreneur, as my friend from library said, or as it may be to work for somebody as an employer. This is important. We need to get students ready. So when the Ministry of Education wants to fly legislations in the air and ask us to support or not to support, I think it's being very derogatory. We need to be engaged, Mr. Speaker, and I'm hoping that I stay within parliamentary language because I don't want to get on anybody's wrong side.
Honourable member, let us try to stay on the right side, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We live in a democracy, and Mr. Speaker, with education reform, we need to make the students, like I said, feel as if they are part of society, as if they are ready to move on and to be part of life. So we need to make the school system as real as it gets, Mr. Speaker. When you look at democracy, Mr. Speaker, it involves making people part of something, whether it be through voting, whether it be through whatever, they may feel inclusive. The school system as it is today is not like that, and I'm sure that legislation that is ready to be passed in this house would still have it in the same way. Students need to be engaged, Mr. Speaker. We need to engage the students. What do you want? How can we help you? The students are our customer at this point, Mr. Speaker. So I need the member from Castries South to remember this when tabling this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. We speak of TVET, like I said, technical and vocational training. You understand? And that could play an essential role, Mr. Speaker, in when we think of everything seriously. It can play an essential role. We have to also realize that TVET already encompasses a wide cross segment of the school's curriculum, Mr. Speaker. Home economics, food and nutrition, clothing and textile, agriculture, technical drawing, woodwork, EDPM, okay, auto mechanics, building technology, plumbing, electrical engineering, home life and resource management, arts and craft, and some that we may not even expect to be in the examples of TVET. People, Mr. Speaker, principles of business. Did you know that? Principles of accounts, office administration, physical education, Mr. Speaker. All these are part and parcel of the TVET unit, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member, you have 3 minutes to conclude your presentation.
Noted, Mr. Speaker. We are and have been sitting on a gold mine, and it is now in our best interest, Mr. Speaker, to learn from our past experiences, because we've been doing TVET from days. We've been doing TVET from the time I've been in school. I remember doing health and family life, Mr. Speaker. I remember doing physical education. I did business for CXC. So that has been there for a while, and I left school, 10 years ago? So TVET has been working, Mr. Speaker. So we need to learn. What the synopsis I want to really bring to the table is that we need to learn from what is right now and then build on it. Not just bring in a new system and say, okay, we're going to make that better because for making it better sake, for making ourselves look nice and putting things on paper, Mr. Speaker. We need to think of the trend. We need to go to the trend. We need to go to the society. We need to think of people outside there. We have to make this thing something that is really transformative, Mr. Speaker. Okay, I will address agriculture, Mr. Speaker, and let me just start by saying, the Honorable Ignatius J. Statistics taken from the National Policy Plan Summary Booklet of 2006. The strategic importance of the agriculture sector, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, within the broader context of sustaining sound rural living, rural livelihoods and economic diversification can be optimized. It has been recognized that despite the many converging challenges, the agriculture sector remains one of the untapped potentials and limitless opportunities. Mr. Speaker, when I listened to the Minister of Agriculture here today, I basically got the same thing. I got the same message.
Member, you have 1 more minute to conclude your presentation. Member for Vifor South.
Mr. Speaker, I stand on Standing Order 3210 to allow the Honourable Member an additional 5 minutes in which to complete his presentation.
Honourable members, the question is that the member for Denver South be allowed an additional 5 minutes to complete his presentation. I now put the question. As many as of this opinion, say aye. Aye. As many are of contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Mr. Please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable members. Mr. Speaker, like I said, when we speak of agriculture, the two disciplinaries, the two thoughts were the same. And Mr. Speaker, we're looking at a span of over 10, close to 20 years. So, in essence, Mr. Speaker, agriculture has really not changed, Mr. Speaker. From 2006, and what I heard from the Honourable Minister, it is almost the same. We need to realize, Mr. Speaker, okay, through agriculture, agricultural science, the subject of agricultural science, Mr. Speaker, we need to foster a bridge between the formal education system and our nation's food security. I cannot emphasize that enough, Mr. Speaker, because we, like the member said, have a very large food import bill, okay, and we need to take care of this. We have a deficit. We're working with a very large deficit, Mr. Speaker. We need to realize the importance of the importance that agriculture plays in, and bring that in, Mr. Speaker, to our children, make them understand that from a very tender age, Mr. Speaker. We need to make maybe primary school have kitchen, have each school have a kitchen garden, and it may not be feasible in Masha at the RC school in Masha. It may not be feasible, but it's feasible in Dennery. We have a lot of land. It's feasible in Larry Shoes and through the various schools in the Dennery Valley. It's feasible in Miku and all the other rural areas in St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. And let me beg to also say, Mr. Speaker, if this is done properly and managed properly, you could find a surplus. You could find that these schools can actually sell that produce and even help themselves. You could even find, Mr. Speaker, that those schools can help those in the city areas, you understand? In the urban areas, Mr. Speaker, by helping to support their food and nutrition program. So this is very important. We need to take care of our children, Mr. Speaker. We also need to upgrade. We need to upgrade our agriculture system. Mr. Speaker, the reason why people do not like agriculture, the reason why people do not want to see agriculture as a means of living is because we've made it so difficult here in St. Lucia. You understand? And we've not moved with the times. We've not moved with agricultural practices and innovations that have happened over the years, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is so mind-boggling, Mr. Speaker. You could have a farm in a building. You can have aquaponics. You can have so many different things, Mr. Speaker, that could support our agriculture system. But you know what we choose to do? We choose to be lazy, and we choose to wait, Mr. Speaker, for us to easily just order food from the United States, which has so much GMOs in it. Order fruit. I even hear from China. I'm not too sure. I'm hoping not, because, Mr. Speaker, these days, you know. So, Mr. Speaker, we need to think of that. We need to think of climatic changes, Mr. Speaker, and how it is that we can collaborate the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Infrastructure, and the Ministry of Agriculture, Mr. Speaker. That is very important, because in St. Lucia, I realize we have a situation where people just think of things separately. There's a Ministry of Education, they do what they do. There's a Ministry of Agriculture, they do what they do. But, Mr. Speaker, we need to work as one country. We need to get things to work for us.
Member, you have 2 minutes to conclude this presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think I will need more. But, Mr. Speaker, I also have to address the situation of healthcare. So I think I'll jump into that. Healthcare, Mr. Speaker, is something we need to think of a way of balancing or getting children, youth, again, I say we need to get them very early, and education reform is something that can work, Mr. Speaker. We need to think of how we can get those children to, in primary schools, think health-wise. The member for ancillary visitors, Mr. Speaker, Denry North spoke about the situation we have with diabetes on island, Mr. Speaker, and it's something that is really terrible. We need to get this together. But I believe it starts with the children. The children in the primary schools, moving on to the secondary schools. So by that time they leave secondary schools, Mr. Speaker, there is a culture that says, you know, this is healthy, this is not. This is local, this is not. And this is what we know, what's in there, but that we don't really know. We're working with labels and
Mr.
packaging.
Speaker, I'd like to stand on a point of order.
Member.
Mr. Speaker, it seems that my member opposite is suffering from a short attention span, because if he listened earlier when I answered the question, I stated that what the Ministry of Health is currently doing, we are currently...
Member, one moment. Member, could you please turn off your mic? Thank you.
We are currently working on the removal of sodas in schools to help with non-communicable diseases or students in schools. So I've already established that these aspects of health are being touched on. So I see no relevance to what the minister is saying right now. Thank you.
Thank you, member.
Mr. Speaker, in my humble opinion, that is not enough.
Honourable member, could you please wait until I call on you to speak?
No problem, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for the resolve, clarification was given as per your comments and your remarks. You may now continue. You do have 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I do agree to some extent, but we need to also listen to what this member said. We have one of the highest levels of non-communicable disease rates or levels in the Americas. So we need to be more robust than that. Taking out a little few drinks from a primary school is not enough. We need to think of the future. We need to get those children educated. We need to, so I understand if you, and I agree with you. I am not saying it is a bad thing. I understand, but Mr. Speaker, I think we need to be more progressive than this, Mr. Speaker. So that is a start, yes, and I agree, but we need to be more progressive. Mr. Speaker, so we need to tie health, we need to tie agriculture, we need to tie education together, Mr. Speaker, and get things moving for our country. It is also my hope, Mr. Speaker, after the sun sets on this activity, it does not become another shelf talker or confidential folder being the dreams of a nation filed away on the pedestal of a ministry, its archives section. But Mr. Speaker, we could sit on the nexus of growth and development through education, Mr. Speaker. The possibilities are endless for us, Mr. Speaker. We need to be diligent. We need to be aggressive, Mr. Speaker. We need to be steadfast, Mr. Speaker. We need to be hungry for success, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member, I do apologize, but your time has elapsed.
And I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Dennery South. Member for Castries East and Minister for National Security, Justice, Home and Legal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good day to you. Good day, members of government, members to the opposite, citizens of this country and constituents of Castries East. I'd like to applaud the member for Dennery South on that enticing presentation. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to wish this House and its members, along with all the persons viewing, a very happy 41st Independence. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to start by introducing this Honorable House to a quote by Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, who once said, and I beg to quote Mr. Speaker, "Education is a human right with immense power to transform. On its foundation rest the cornerstones of freedom, democracy, and sustainable human development." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, it is truly a pleasure to be standing in agreement of the motion being laid today in this Honorable House. And today, Mr. Speaker, as I look around me, I see many young people who have been blessed within their lives to receive a proper education underneath this current educational system. But Mr. Speaker, what really is a proper education? Mr. Speaker, is a proper education allowing a child to sit in a class that he or she has no interest in and just hope that they digest the information that is being fed to them? Or, Mr. Speaker, is a proper education beyond just teaching a child facts? Is it also teaching them skills? Skills that they can be equipped with, not just for a career, but for life. Mr. Speaker, I assure you that this NYC government believes that education is no longer a privilege in this day and age, but it is a right that belongs to me, a right that belongs to you, Mr. Speaker, and a right that belongs to the citizens of this country. Mr. Speaker, I say to the members opposite that this educational reform will be the foundation where the cornerstones of our youth will be laid. Mr. Speaker, I was born and raised in the constituency of Castries East, a constituency that has been stigmatized by outsiders looking in. My constituency has been plagued by the social ills of juvenile delinquency and youth violence. Mr. Speaker, too many times have I spoken to young people in my constituency who share with me their stories about how they are unable to learn in their schools and how many times they really just do not get the point of what is being taught and why it is being taught. Mr. Speaker, you see, they see no use in them being taught these subjects, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with our rate of dropouts currently being at 1.8% as of 2016 to 2017, according to the statistical department, maybe even higher 3 years later, we can see that the problem is not our youth, but instead, it is our schools and their capacity to properly educate and accommodate the young minds of this country. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, we can see that the dropouts within this country frequently become involved in criminal activities. So, Mr. Speaker, why is nothing being done? Mr. Speaker, the rope that ties education and juvenile delinquency together is one of familiar face to many. But does the thought that a teenager or even a child is more likely to be driven towards a path of crime than to be driven towards a life of success through meaningful education even bother the members to the opposite? There are a wide variety of reasons as to why children aren't attending their classes or even school as it is supposed to be. And persons fail to realize that when a child misses several school days or classes, they do not reap the true benefit of education, nor do they become properly disciplined within their day-to-day life. Mr. Speaker, this NYC government has realized that it is not all of our students who possess that academic inclination. And we as a government of the people must be able to reach out to those who want to specialize in the area of technical and vocational education and training. Mr. Speaker, with the introduction of TVET programs, I believe that the youth can be directed towards gaining various skill sets that can and will positively impact their lives. Mr. Speaker, as Minister for Justice, National Security and Legal Affairs, my ministry believes that educational reform will be the first step to ensuring that crime is brought to a minimum within this country. Mr. Speaker, a proper education system cannot be provided to ensure that crime will be depleted. A proper education system cannot be provided without proper accommodation within the facilities that it is being housed, Mr. Speaker. Meaning that our schools now need to be treated the way that they were meant to be treated, Mr. Speaker. They need to become a place where like-minded students can come together to study and learn proper skills and gain necessary training, whether it be for the academic pursuits or technical pursuits, Mr. Speaker. By allowing our youth to access these skills, we as a government are now able to intervene and keep our youth off the streets during this crucial period of growth and learning within their lives. Mr. Speaker, again, we cannot guarantee that crime will be eradicated fully. However, through meaningful engagement by both students and teachers, we can and we will reduce crime among our youth population. Thus, Mr. Speaker, proper education needs to be provided to the youth of this country. Mr. Speaker, it is to my belief that one of the biggest lessons that may have been taught to every single person sitting inside here today is that we should remain in school at all costs, as having a proper education is the first step to achieving success and earning a living. Mr. Speaker, through you I ask the opposition, why is it now that our so-called proper education has left 36.3% of our youth unemployed as of 2018, according to the Statistical Department? Pardon?
Members,
hello?
order,
Hello?
please, order.
Are you all on the floor right now? Okay, thank you. And as many of us may know, Mr. Speaker, a vast majority of those persons without a proper education are not even being granted a job opportunity. Mr. Speaker, a poor education leads to high unemployment, Mr. Speaker, which leads to poverty, which leads to crime. Mr. Speaker, I cannot be the only member seeing this vicious cycle. Mr. Speaker, it's often seen that poverty heavily influences the manner in which a student is able to attain his or her education. With the adversities inflicted upon one's education by poverty, we see that persons are now left unemployed. Mr. Speaker, may I remind you that a poor or even non-existent education leaves little to no useful employment skills to our youth. And if given a choice between poverty or crime, the latter will be chosen, as it now becomes one of the very few alternatives towards a gainful employment. Mr. Speaker, I reassure you that this government is serious about doing all that it can to educate the young minds of this country, as it will be one of the best combatants against crime. Mr. Speaker, I think that it is worth taking note that the introduction of TVET programs will have an impact on the flow of savings for our health system and in particular our justice system. The introduction of this program will be prudent to the allocation of resources to strategies with known crime and violence prevention effects. Mr. Speaker, for this program is important not only in teaching students the academic skills that are needed to achieve success, but it also teaches positive social attitudes and skills while helping students develop friendships and a sense of belonging, all of which have been proven to contribute to the development of a high self-esteem. Mr. Speaker, if any honorable member in here today thinks that self-esteem does not affect crime, I have come to prove them wrong. Mr. Speaker, I beg to quote Carrie Meyer, an assistant professor of criminal justice at Indiana University East, who once said, and I quote, "Self-esteem is interesting because it gains a lot of attention, but at the same time is overshadowed when it comes to its protective effects for certain negative behaviors like crime and delinquency." End of quote, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, from 42 studies over the span of 25 years, with over 70,000 individuals, Ms. Meyer was able to find a negative relationship between self-esteem and crime and delinquency among the youth. To put that into perspective, Mr. Speaker, Ms. Meyer found that youth who possess a lower self-esteem were more likely to have engaged in illegal behaviors and criminal activity than those who possessed a high self-esteem. Mr. Speaker, through the introduction of the civic subject to all schools on island, and not only that select few, we believe that students will be encouraged to build their character, build their self-esteem, to be able to motivate themselves to do better and not remain at that constant level where they think that they are not good enough. Mr. Speaker, the introduction of TVET programs will serve multiple purposes besides promoting one's character growth. But our key purpose of implementing this program is to prepare our youth for work, as it has widely been recognized that TVET programs have had an important role to play in tackling youth unemployment through its orientation to the world of work and its ability to help persons acquire employable skills. Mr. Speaker, as we near the end of my presentation, earlier today a very interesting point was raised by the Minister for Education and representative for Castries South. Sorry about that. About the usefulness of the common entrance examination in this new age of students. Mr. Speaker, as I stand here in front of you, from personal experience, the feeling of knowing
that the next 5 years of your life, or even the rest of your life, can be determined by one test on one day is absolutely absurd. Mr. Speaker, I am dumbfounded as to how in this new age of students, our students are still being plagued by this cruel test of the past. Today, Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Education also stated that there should be an aptitude test put into place as an alternative to the common entrance examination, which I believe tied in well with the point raised by the Minister for Youth Development, Sports and Social Transformation and representative for Mikud South, that students should be introduced to TVET-based subjects from grade 4, which will give students the opportunity to explore a wide spectrum of careers and skills that they may like, while assisting both teachers and parents alike, as now they are able to realize both the strengths and weaknesses of their child.
Honourable Member, you have 3 minutes in which to conclude your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the implementation of these subjects, students will be assessed throughout the next 3 years as they move on to partake in the proposed aptitude tests, all of which will form as an evolving continuous assessment of the students. Mr. Speaker, as I stand here in full support of this motion, I can also stand here firm in my support of the ideas which follow it, Mr. Speaker. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say to the opposition through you that education is not a privilege, but it is a right. And now is the time. Let's do this together. Let's educate St. Lucia. I thank you.
Thank you, Member for Castries East and Minister for National Security, Justice, Home and Legal Affairs. Member for Choiseul Saltibus and Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon, honorable members. It is a pleasure, I must say, Mr. Speaker, to stand in this honorable house and represent a place where I call home. A place where I never intend to stray from, Mr. Speaker. As I like to always say, leave Choiseul, go where, why, for what. We have everything, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to extend condolences to a member on our opposition side who lost a family member. You see, Mr. Speaker, where I'm from, I consider it the most picturesque community. Our beauty abounds from the head of Lamaz all the way down to where our president of the NYC is from. You see, our topography still speaks to the countryside and the country life of things. An untouched, beautiful part of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. While mentioning the president of the NYC and Choiseul, of course, I would like to commend the NYC on a very well executed lead up to youth parliament. The committee, the team, on behalf of all members, we thank you. Mr. Speaker, permit me for a second to congratulate our independent queen contestant from Choiseul for participation in the recently concluded Miss Independence contest, where she of course did not win, but I would like to encourage her with the words of Nelson Mandela, and if I may quote, Mr. Speaker, I never lose, I either win or I learn. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, further I would like to congratulate Miss Aliyah Alfred, who hails from the community of Choiseul, Mr. Speaker, Miss Shania Cooper, Miss Alicia Herman, and also Miss Julia Simon, who is also from Choiseul. Mr. Speaker, these young ladies have secured a side on the St. Lucia national cricket team, and I'd like to commend them for that. You see, Mr. Speaker, Choiseul is the type of place you get all sorts of talent, but the struggle has been the ability to harness these talents and move them forward. But Mr. Speaker, as we are all aware, we have further debate, so the time will be right to approach these things. And like a famous TV show, and one of my favorite writers said, that is for another show. Mr. Speaker, I sat with my opposition colleagues. We began dissecting the motion. And within our caucus, we said, you know, we don't have to oppose the motion, Mr. Speaker, for opposing's sake. But at the same time, the motion was deficient in many ways as to the resolution it pointed to of strengthening and expanding the capacity of our workforce pointed out by the members before me. Mr. Speaker, growing up in Choiseul, you appreciate Creole phrases, Mr. Speaker. And I would always hear growing up, the older people say, Mr. Speaker, like you have one. Mr. Speaker, what that means, you cannot bend the tree, Mr. Speaker, when it has already reached a certain level. Mr. Speaker, I say this to say, a lot of references were made here today about Jamaica, and I've heard this phrase used in Jamaica also, bend the tree while it's young, because when it's all old, it will broke. Meaning, educate your children when they are young, the right way, because when they are older, it will be harder. The lessons you want to teach them, they're already set in their paths, already set in their ways. Mr. Speaker, as we speak educational reform, we need to take a holistic approach to this thing. We need to look at the systematic changes that are needed to facilitate this reform we speak of. Not just reform, but reform that impacts and implements results, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've listened to the debates today and the contribution from members opposite and members of the government side. And to my recollection, I think only 2 instances early childhood education was mentioned, Mr. Speaker. For many years, we have focused on primary, secondary, and tertiary level of education and speak to these areas. We highlight these areas as the areas that need reform. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a document of the House, the government recurrent expenditures on education for the period 2013 to 2019, Mr. Speaker, where we see an allocation of $2.6 million from the period 2013 to 2019 being allocated to early childhood education. And for future reference, Mr. Speaker, I want to point to a direct correlation in terms of adult education, which the same ratio is experienced at 0.8, a decline at 0.7 in 2014, and then the steady of 0.8, 0.8, 0.8. Mr. Speaker, I urge members to hold on to this document as I'll be drawing reference to it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last year's budget address by the Honorable Prime Minister cited 19 mentions of the word education. But not once in that speech, Mr. Speaker, was early childhood education mentioned, or education rather used in the context of early childhood education, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if I may quote the Honorable Prime Minister, he was clear in his statement. He said, in this regard, if I may quote, we will advance efforts to modernize our school curriculum and teaching methods so that we can raise pass rates and provide our young people with the skills that will enable them to find rewarding and productive work. This is the main aim of our education strategy. End of quote, Mr. Speaker. On the other hand, on the flip side, a legislative review has been commissioned of early childhood centers under the funding agency OAS 30022 to a tune of $225,503. Mr. Speaker, if we are speaking about educational reform and taking it seriously, we need to expend and show it in our expenditure as a government, Mr. Speaker. We definitely need to do that. This is not sufficient. While it is welcome, of course, for the reform, it is not sufficient. Mr. Speaker, we are still trying to bend that tree at the wrong stage, in my opinion, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister in his address, the Youth Prime Minister, cited dropouts, and also another member of the government spoke to the lack of male teachers, Mr. Speaker. The introduction of TVET as part of this motion, if I may review and refer to the social and economic review, it says that 60% of males, of dropouts, sorry, Mr. Speaker, are males. And more importantly, Mr. Speaker, males that fail math, it's over 60%. And we are talking, Mr. Speaker, from the primary level up. These statistics speak to the primary level up. No account for early childhood education, Mr. Speaker. One of the priorities of the Ministry of Education is gender equality and human rights, Mr. Speaker. And one of the measuring sticks and indicators of the Ministry of Education is the dropout rate by gender at all levels. According to the Educational Sector Development Plan for the period 2015 to 2020, this is in this document, Mr. Speaker. This is a document by this administration. Mr. Speaker, there is a clear disconnect for our boys. And if you will bear with me, Mr. Speaker, to go a bit further, I may interest you in allowing me to play devil's advocate for a second and draw reference to our incarceration, sex, and age ranges, Mr. Speaker. In preparation for this debate, I reached out to the Bodily Correctional Facility to point to some numbers and statistics, Mr. Speaker. And at the facility, there are 295 males between the ages of 17 to 35 years old, Mr. Speaker. If we plug this number into a calculator and try to find a percentage, what we'll return to is 59.59%, which is in direct correlation to the 60% who fail math and the 60% who drop out, Mr. Speaker. What does this statistics point to, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I heard the Prime Minister again speaking to programming, to information technology. Mr. Speaker, my background is information technology, Mr. Speaker. And if you may allow me to guide the Prime Minister through you, Mr. Speaker, I'd really appreciate that. Because from early childhood education, a greater emphasis needs to be placed on boys and mathematics. Mr. Speaker, a vast amount of young men especially are into tech, into computers, into programming, into DJing, into photography, into all these sort of things centered around ICT. But for the purpose of this debate, Mr. Speaker, let's focus on programming. And there is a document that speaks to the priority list of the government, Mr. Speaker, if I can find it. And on this priority list, under science and technology, information and communications technology rank very, very highly, Mr. Speaker. Computer-generated animation, computer engineering, computer forensics. Mr. Speaker, allow me to share an example with you. Please, Mr. Speaker, choisir, est-ce que là où planter la Chine, pour pas ça jamais récolter banane. And for the Minister of Culture who might not understand what I mean, Mr. Speaker, if you plant dashing, you cannot get breadfruit, you cannot get macabu, you cannot get any of these things, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, again on the IT standpoint, let us evaluate the ability needed to code. You see, Mr. Speaker, computer programming is a wonderful thing, but to get into computer programming, there is some understanding of arithmetic that needs to be there. I'm not saying, Mr. Speaker, that you need a 1 or a 2 in mathematics to program, of course. I'm not saying that, not remotely. What I'm trying to show is that without a background and knowing and understanding of math, which goes a very long way in programming and manipulating the program, manipulating algorithms, manipulating technology, binary is literally ones and zeros, Mr. Speaker. Binary is a computer language understood by computers, and if our kids do not understand math, our boys don't understand arithmetic, understand math, we cannot push them forward in that vein, no matter how highly it is rated on the priority list, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, math is often a topic that kids, especially younger ones, struggle with, Mr. Speaker. Teaching new concepts for teachers, Mr. Speaker, it has been difficult. It has been cited by a number of teachers. Mr. Speaker, to create actions or outputs in a computer system, this is basic math. If you take or add away a line, you will get a different end product, Mr. Speaker. To keep with the example above, a student needs to consider how to code the angle of a ball bounce, which is geometry, to make sure that the computer subtracts 2 blocks, which is arithmetic, when they get hit. So you see, Mr. Speaker, how important the math is in computer engineering, which is one of the high-rated disciplines on the science and technology list, on the priority list, of course, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm a country boy at heart. And in my constituency, believe it or not, Creole is the first language for many households in 2020 up till this day, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Sue said, no, let me address you properly, Mr. Speaker. In your previous life, Mr. Speaker, I would like to believe you were a teacher in your previous life, Mr. Speaker. So through you, Mr. Speaker, I would like to draw reference to this. Mr. Speaker, you tell a student your dad has 3 mangoes and your mother has 4 mangoes. What is the sum, Mr. Speaker? What is the coefficient? What is the product of these things? Sometimes something so simple cannot be understood by a child because of the language barrier, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, même ti mama là, Mr. Speaker, si you mama only 4 mango and papa only 3 mango, combien mango qu'il y a kaila? You'll be surprised to see, Mr. Speaker, that is able or she is able to understand and answer you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've seen cases where students and children communicate better in Creole. I am a firm believer that the Creole language should be taught in schools, but carefully, Mr. Speaker, not just taught like Spanish or French or these languages, Mr. Speaker. It has to be integrated into our learning scheme of things. Because, of course, it is our mother tongue. We understand it on a different level, Mr. Speaker. We just don't speak it, we understand it. Mr. Speaker, the angles we use to reach our children, language is a great tool, but also sometimes can also be a great barrier. Mr. Speaker, growing up, I always heard it, you know. And sometimes, when you leave shows and you go out and you speak Creole, people will laugh at you. But now, it's changing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and if I may shift your attention, Mr. Speaker, to Singapore. Singapore is a very interesting model, from education to the economy to everything about Singapore. And Mr. Speaker, there is something in my research preparing for this debate I came across called MTL. And I just don't want to stand here, Mr. Speaker, as leader of the opposition and bash the Prime Minister and bash the Minister of Education. I would like to make some recommendations, of course, for the implementation of this. There is something called the mother tongue language, where they incorporate from early childhood education, not from the primary level, not from the secondary level, but from the early childhood education, the use of the mother tongue. Anu servi lang mamanu, Mr. Speaker. The mother tongue needs to be taught from the preschool years. We will build a strong foundation for bilingual learning, Mr. Speaker, and comprehension of many things related directly to the education journey from early childhood education to the tertiary level. Because, Mr. Speaker, a lot of times we think that communication is the problem, Mr. Speaker. But sometimes comprehension is actually the problem. Mr. Speaker, does little Jack really understand what Miss Jackie is teaching in the class? Do they really comprehend this with all this reform and all this TVET and all these things? Yes, this is wonderful, but do they understand this? Do they understand the concept of it, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, there are some young kids I interact with, and being a technology person, it's mind-boggling to see how they interact with technology today, Mr. Speaker. I've seen a friend of mine, his daughter, interact with an iPad and his mobile phone and switch from mommy shark to daddy shark to all types of shark. with no involvement of the parents, and I'm talking about 2-, 3-year-old students who are able to access the World Wide Web without parents not even being able to monitor this, not understanding social media reputation management, what's on there, what's on the mobile web that they need to filter, of course, for these children. Mr. Speaker, it's a ticklish topic, but I think I need to shed some light on it just to bring home my point in terms of the previous document and early child education and adult education, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, allow me to roll back something like the laptop program, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there was a time when laptops were given out to students which were supposed to aid in the education process and facilitate learning. But I think a big trick was missed in that initiative, because what you find is that while you give a child a laptop, you also give a child an instrument to bring into the household that a parent who is not computer literate cannot monitor. They have no idea what's going on there. So, Mr. Speaker, initiatives like this are good, but we need to capitalize holistically on them. For example, an initiative like that, parents are supposed to be trained also to become computer literate so they could monitor these laptops. So you find that you kill 2 birds with 1 stone, if I may use the reference of, can't remember the member. But you find that you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You educate a mother who is able to, of course, use it for her own personal benefit and now monitor the child. Mr. Speaker, it'd be remiss of me not to speak to arts and culture, and so many on the government have spoken about it. Arts and culture is dear to me, Mr. Speaker, because of where I come from. I come from Shrewsbury, which is the mecca for arts and craft in St. Lucia. And arts and craft has suffered, and arts and craft has not been integrated into the curriculum and the learning scheme in St. Lucia. And that's a very sad thing, because we find that now we are losing the people who make the straw baskets. Mr. Speaker, can you imagine 20 years from now? This is my work bag, Mr. Speaker. I can make it an instrument. Can I make an instrument of the house or something like that so they can pass it around so they can see it? Mr. Speaker, 10, 20 years from now, who is going to make this, Mr. Speaker? Where can we find this if we do not harness our arts and craft, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, a national environment or ecosystem must be cultivated that respects and promotes arts, culture, and heritage. Because arts is one thing, culture is one thing, and heritage is another thing. We need to preserve all 3 of these things, Mr. Speaker. And recognizing the important role that it must play in the development of our people, society, and nation is something we sometimes take for granted, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, any nation or any country that does not cultivate or support its culture and the arts has no true sense of who they are as a nation or country. There is no sense of identity, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our truths are something we need to be aware of. Our reality is something we need to pay close attention to. A huge part of education and youth development is the arts. Mr. Speaker, in keeping with the resolution and of course the motion, which specifically speaks to strengthening the workforce of this country, which speaks to strengthening the social fabric and construct of Ianola, the Helen of the West, St. Lucia. We have so many names for this beautiful place. Paying attention to the arts is essential in developing our country holistically. Mr. Speaker, an article, if I may quote from an article, Mr. Speaker, by Mr. Jimmy Anthony, the Curriculum Specialist for Technology and Integration. Mr. Speaker, he said that it is a bit scary when you think about artificial intelligence culture, blockchain technology, and Internet of Things, and realize that we have not participated in developing, producing, nor manipulating those things, Mr. Speaker. And it is true. We speak about it like my member said, we speak about it, we speak about it, we speak about it, but what do we do about it, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, all of this talk about arts and culture is not just talk, because it is part of the education system. The citizens past and present whose hard work and selfless devotion to community and country that mole-led and fabricated and helped develop our country should be recognized on a national level, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if we take some time, we pause and appreciate our heroes who have gone before us, because it is the result of many who have gone before us. We 16 young parliamentarians are here today, Mr. Speaker. Demonstrating this public appreciation is salient. The member for Canary spoke about the light. But Mr. Speaker, in our motto it says the land, the people, and the light. And for argument purposes, I want to specify and stay on the part of the people, Mr. Speaker. Because in the middle is the people. The people are always the most important, Mr. Speaker. Above all is always the people, and people sometimes need to be honored. A society of gratitude and thanksgiving is the very construct that is lacking in our society today. Mr. Speaker, while the Honorable Prime Minister gives our lands away to investors, Mr. Speaker, construction of a national center for performing arts is warranted, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you see the arts. Allow me, Mr. Speaker, for a minute to draw reference to last year I visited Carifesta in Trinidad, and it was my first taste of theater arts. And Mr. Speaker, I was in great company. I'm speaking to the likes of Mr. Kendall Hippolyte, Mr. Robert Lee, Mr. Ford, Lapo Cabwit, Mr. Speaker. And exchanging views with these local legends was, should I say, fortifying, Mr. Speaker. It enriched your appreciation for many things, St. Lucian, that time, of course, will not permit me today, Mr. Speaker. At Carifesta, Mr. Speaker, the St. Lucian folk tale was on show. It was a wonderful experience, Mr. Speaker, taking in the St. Lucian folk tale. But it was sad that I had to go all the way to Trinidad to take in a St. Lucian folk tale that speaks to St. Lucian culture and St. Lucian history, Mr. Speaker. You know, growing up in Choiseul, you always hear old stories of Laja Bless, Kokma, and all these things. I grew up on the steps hearing old people talk about this. But now, I've realized something, that with the arts, you are able to educate your nation. You are able to perpetuate your ideals through the arts, Mr. Speaker. Because with the arts, Mr. Speaker, you see it, you taste it, it almost appeals to all the senses. You feel the atmosphere. And I am of the opinion, Mr. Speaker, that while the reform is important in the curriculum, Mr. Speaker, the society as a whole needs some reform. And implementation and building things of that nature, Mr. Speaker, would again strengthen the social fabric of our country. Mr. Speaker, the motion speaks to promoting the moral, cultural, intellectual, and physical development of students and society. And Mr. Speaker, I think the arts is key. Recently, Mr. Speaker, on Facebook, I saw an ad, a Checkapesh ad. I think it goes, from my Capon. Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of talent that exists in St. Lucia. And while we can highlight Checkapesh and so many other groups that are centered around the arts, I urge the Prime Minister, Minister of Infrastructure, the necessary ministries, of course, to construct a center for performing arts, which would make it would make it easier to educate our young people from the early childhood education level to the tertiary level of our history, of our culture, because it is important in the whole process of educational reform. Mr. Speaker, I think all of us here around the table are quite familiar with Instagram, Facebook, and the social media side of things. And we would know of talents like Kidel, Noah from Soufre, and so many other people who post on social media.
Member, you have 3 minutes to conclude your presentation. 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is time we create proper incubators to ensure that after birth of these young ones, we can harness their creative gifts that will one day grow into the men and women that shape our workforce, which is what the resolution of this motion speaks to. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, to complement the arts is also a place for craft to be displayed and also taught, to be entwined into our early childhood plan, a place where visitors can come and see a piece of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, where our truths are told and displayed for the world to see, but also for us to learn. Mr. Speaker, I turn your attention to my constituency and the Choiseul Craft Center, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this place has been somewhere where visitors from all over the world have come, but over the past...
Member for Grosley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to invoke Standing Order 3210 and provide the member an additional 3 minutes to conclude his presentation.
Honourable members, the question is that the member for Choiseul Southwest and leader of the opposition be granted an additional 3 minutes to conclude his presentation. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honourable member, please proceed. You do have 4 minutes to conclude.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, honourable members. Mr. Speaker, I was trying to draw attention to the Choiseul Arts and Craft Center, which has deteriorated over the past 10 years. And I grew up right opposite that craft center, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a national museum, along with a location for performing arts, is something that this country needs. Because our early childhood, primary, secondary, or even tertiary level, where do we go to learn how to make a coal pot, Mr. Speaker? Where to make a kanawi? How to weave a basket, Mr. Speaker? Where do we go? Let us create an atmosphere whereby our kids can walk the halls and see carvings like Tribulation, done by Mr. Francis Joseph Part of Choiseul, which one I call a masterpiece. It stands at 15 feet tall on its base and is 13 feet wide at its widest part and depicts Christ between the two thieves. It has been given the name Tribulation. Mr. Speaker, how many kids can go and hear this story, hear this history, understand that? A part of this reform speaks to the intricacies of educational reform. The motion says, Mr. Speaker, promote the spiritual, moral, cultural, intellectual, and physical development, Mr. Speaker. An important part of educational reform, Mr. Speaker, and also strengthening and expanding the capacity of our citizens is what this motion speaks to, and allowing these infrastructure will facilitate easier education, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if we adopt these principles, it will set our young people on a course of national service to contribute to national development, because one day, when they go, they will be appreciated, they will be spoken of, they will be written about, Mr. Speaker. Nelson Mandela said it best, and if I may quote, Mr. Madiba said, the ideals we cherish are our fondest dreams and fervent hopes may not be realized in our lifetime, Mr. Speaker, but that itself is beside the point. But knowing that we did what we had to do in our time is what is most important. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I would like to urge the Prime Minister and Minister of Education that getting the students an early start is important. Setting this momentum is imperative with technology, as we need to get our children on this course. Teaching students that there are many pathways to success. Above all, like my members on this side spoke of, is teacher quality and growth, as highlighted. Mr. Speaker, there is a need, in order to fix the problem and bridge the gap, we need to invest in facilitating effective parental and community involvement in this bid for educational reform, Mr. Speaker. In my humble opinion, there are 4 major factors we need to pay attention to: the child, the teacher, the parent, and the environment. Mr. Speaker, if I may quote Mr. Mandela again, Madiba said, "Education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world." End of quote. And as globalization has made this world a global village, our reality, Mr. Speaker, is 238 square miles. This is our world, Mr. Speaker. And Minister of Education, Honorable Prime Minister, I urge you and I caution you, be very wary of what ammunition you give the early childhood, the primary, and secondary kids. I thank you.
Thank you, Member for Susa and Saltibus and Leader of the Opposition. Member for Castries South and Minister for Education, Innovation, Human Resource Development, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is indeed my pleasure to close this debate, Mr. Speaker, with the final reply as to the presentations that we have had in this Honorable House today. Mr. Speaker, if you are well aware, let's drift our attention away from the Honorable House today, just for some time, and realize it was not planned, but that every government member here is wearing some shade of blue. Now, Mr. Speaker, after delving, the honorable members and I, after delving in what blue means, Mr. Speaker, we had some spiritual words as to trust, loyalty, faith, and intelligence. Mr. Speaker, we trust because the young people has placed their trust in this NYC government, because we are loyal to the young people of this country, because they have faith in us for passing this motion, and that we are government are intelligent because we know what we are about here today. Mr. Speaker, for one moment I thought I was in some theatrical performance, Mr. Speaker, and not a parliamentary sitting. But Mr. Speaker, I must applaud the youth parliamentarians for participating in this debate today, and I must say it truly reflects the theme of the NYC: participation, peace, progress. With the peaceful participation of our young people, there shall be positive progress in our country, St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, I may think that today some members opposite were crumbled by our presentations, but we'll get to that later. Mr. Speaker, we recognize the involvement of all consultants for our students in this Honorable House, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, our PM laid that out easily, Mr. Speaker, and well articulated the basis of building our students, Mr. Speaker. Our PM gave the historical standpoint of the current education system and how we can maneuver to enter into a new reform for education. So, Speaker, through you, it seems like members opposite copy and paste our presentations today. Because, Mr. Speaker, that's what we see here today, Mr. Speaker. And that, Mr. Speaker, I think that when I said in my presentation we must place emphasis on critical thinking, I think we should do it in this Honorable House, Mr. Speaker, for our members, for members opposite, Mr. Speaker. So, Speaker, at the same time, we acknowledge as a government the infrastructure needs of our students, Mr. Speaker, because it is paramount that our students are comfortable when they learn at, Mr. Speaker, because it's like their second home. But members opposite keep saying about crossing your T's and dotting your I's, Mr. Speaker, and speaking about the problems, Mr. Speaker. We must take this step by step. We are debating here the motion which speaks to holistic development of our students in preparing them for society, Mr. Speaker. Lack of critical thinking is evident amongst members opposite, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the DVRP, Disaster Vulnerability Reduction Project, the former Dennery Infant School, Mr. Speaker, in Dennery South, was severely affected by many natural disasters, Mr. Speaker. And with the involvement of this project, it helped within 14 months to open back this school on December 8th, 2017, Mr. Speaker. And that is how this government caters, Mr. Speaker, to Dennery South and to the students of this country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it pleases me that the honorable member, in fact, honorable member opposite is in fact part of a national branch which governs students' rights and responsibilities in this country, Mr. Speaker. But then the member opposite asked, why now? Mr. Speaker, now is the time, let's do this together. Mr. Speaker, it is fitting as young leaders we embrace such. I urge to the member, Mr. Speaker, that stop beating around the bush and come to this house to debate substantially, Mr. Speaker. And that when they are ready, Mr. Speaker, to come back so that we can debate. Mr. Speaker, I urge to the member opposite, if you want to be a steaming train, make sure you carry your passengers to the destination safely, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, national government does not, when it comes to debating this motion, Mr. Speaker, we are here for the best interest and the business of the young people at heart, and this forum gives us the avenue to make a plea to the national administrations, Mr. Speaker. This is why we are here, to conduct the business of the young people, Mr. Speaker. Though most presentations from members opposite, I felt for some moments, Mr. Speaker, I was wandering in the middle of St. Lucia through most of their presentations, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, just a point to note to the members that we do have a hospitality school in the making in St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, from Europe. And we do have hospitality extensions from the Monroe College, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Yoka Vini.
Leader of the opposition, are you standing on a point of order?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Yoka Vini, epi tout malkadi, me yo pa vini e pièce fiction. Mr. Speaker, they are coming out with all the sicknesses, but they have no cures to the sicknesses, Mr. Speaker.
Get away, man.
Mr. Speaker, there's nothing wrong with being an educational doctor. You never know. The proposed aptitude test may test your skills for that career, Mr. Speaker. The motion clearly speaks to systemic changes in the education system, Mr. Speaker. Be it resolved, I would hate to think that we have to bring literacy skills class in this honorable chamber, Mr. Speaker, for members opposite. It speaks, Mr. Speaker, the motion speaks, Mr. Speaker, to that we are not doing only primary or secondary or tertiary skills training at the various levels of education in St. Lucia. That is what the motion speaks to, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker, on a point of order.
Leader of the opposition, member for Shrewsbury South.
Mr. Speaker, the member is misleading the House because there was no instance in his presentation where he spoke to early child education. He spoke only specifically to primary and secondary school education.
Thank you, member. Member for Castries South and Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, that we have made reference to the aptitude test, which includes the testing of skills, which then enrolls them to the school, linked to their skills, but to continue building their numeracy and literacy skills.
Member for Social Saltibus and Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the member is still misleading the House, or I'm just misguided, because a document was made, a document of the House, and I don't know if this is the test he's speaking to, or a career readiness test, because I remember a little cousin of mine coming home with something like the counselor gave them. So I just want to be very clear, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Member for Castries South and Minister for Education. I believe the Leader of the Opposition is seeking clarification.
I stated clearly in my presentation earlier today that this was a type of aptitude test which matches the skills and personalities of the students to help them to find a career at the secondary school level education, Mr. Speaker. That is what I spoke to. If he needs the literacy skills, I am always there to help, Mr. Speaker. But like I was saying, it's which then enrolls them to the school linked with their skills and to continue building them for the numeracy and literacy skills, Mr. Speaker. You know you have to be seated still, you know that.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of...
Members, order please. Members, order please. Leader of the Opposition and Member for Castries South, please turn off your mics. Member for Castries South, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, even though, Mr. Speaker, I would like to clarify that when serious matters are being dealt with in this Honorable House, Mr. Speaker, we don't laugh, especially when such comments were made by members opposite as to a certain, well, I don't even want to delve into it, Mr. Speaker, due to the sensitivity of how it is, Mr. Speaker. And members opposite would actually bang their tables, Mr. Speaker, in accordance with this. But that's for another show, in accordance with the member for Choiseul. Mr. Speaker, they launch an attack, members opposite launch an attack against one of our members here, Mr. Speaker.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the Opposition and Member for Social Saltibus.
Mr. Speaker, I am representing Choiseul, Mr. Speaker, not Choiseul, not Choiseul, Mr. Speaker. So I encourage the member to get it correct when he enunciates and speaks Choiseul, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, member. May that correction be to every member of Parliament today. Member for Castries South, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Choiseul, Mr. Speaker. Okay. Mr. Speaker, but I would urge, as I said, Mr. Speaker, even though you could launch an attack on any of our members, Mr. Speaker, you touch one, you touch all, Mr. Speaker. And we will all be behind our honorable member today, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker...
Members, order, please. Order.
But, Mr. Speaker...
Minister. In the words of the Minister for Castries South, when it comes to the education of the young persons in St. Lucia, I believe it's no laughing matter. Minister, you will proceed, and we shall afford you the silence that you so deserve.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I conclude my reply, Mr. Speaker, I would like to send a note out to civil society and to everybody, Mr. Speaker, that this here from the National Youth Council and from the National Youth Parliament is that we are all here together as one, Mr. Speaker, to bring in the plea of the young people from our various constituencies. Yes, Mr. Speaker, it's a debate, and we have to bring in our proposals, our ideas. But we send a plea out, Mr. Speaker, to the national administrators to know that the young people are ready, Mr. Speaker, to take on the position for decision making in this country, Mr. Speaker. And that this motion here speaks to and is for the young people as to the mission of the NYC to harness and manifest the skills of the young people in this country, Mr. Speaker. I thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member and Minister for Education, Innovation, Human Resource Development and Science and Technology. Honourable Members, the question is that the House of Assembly and the Senate hereby authorizes the Ministry of Education through its various agencies to introduce the necessary reforms in the various levels of the educational sector to accommodate the programs that will provide skills training at the various levels of education in St. Lucia. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of the contrary opinion, say no. No. I believe the noes have it. The noes have it. Honorable Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Foreign Affairs, International Trade, Investment, Local Government and Social Development.
Mr. Speaker, as much as I would like to call for a division, I do trust that as members of the government, based on our contributions today, that the conscience of our people, as well as the constituency and parliamentary representatives here, shall remember our contributions and shall echo on the walls of their heart, Mr. Speaker. But on that note, I would like to beg that the House stands adjourned, sine die, until April.
Honourable Members, the question now is that this House stands adjourned until April sine die. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of the contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. This House now stands adjourned, stand die.
All rise.
So we've now come to the end of today's proceedings. Again, my name is Blossom Sylvester, and I'm your correspondent today for the National Television Network. So today we spoke about many very relevant issues around the topic of educational reform. And in the latter half of today's proceedings, we saw certain topics brought up, such as, well, stuff that really spoke out to me was the scholarship awards. And the inclusion of more scholarship awards as opposed to just the one now that they're offering per division, or the one that they're offering for one division. Yes.
So I believe what was really conveyed is that we want to see more opportunities,
right,
not just for those who are excelling academically, but more opportunities for arts and culture, more opportunities for students to really get into their skill, get into their element. Absolutely. So I believe that was a good point brought about. I believe that even as we went on, the house became even more animated.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we saw a lot of, almost to a comedic level. Yes, absolutely. Actually, not even almost. There was definitely some stuff that made me laugh out loud, actually.
But I think in it all, it encompasses the drive that the representatives came with.
The passion, for sure.
There was definitely a sense of passion, a sense of belonging, a sense of responsibility in their voices as they came about. And there was one parliamentary rep that I quoted. I'm just going to sing through that quickly. Mm-hmm. He actually quoted himself that the catalyst for having a successful career or being successful is not just through education, but just holistically knowledge, being knowledgeable, gaining that knowledge, because a lot of the times we find a lot of our successful people are entrepreneurs. They go ahead and look forward to what the world has to offer them.
And that's one thing that I did notice, that the opposition actually brought up entrepreneurialism and the integration of that, whereas the government did not actually bring that up. So that was definitely a point, and it's an issue that it's close to my heart. Also, the opposition brought about social change, working with social change in conjunction with systematic change, and particularly in the homes, because as the member of Vieux South, I believe it was, mentioned, if the home environment is not conducive to learning, then we can't really expect the student to then go to school and not face the same challenges that they bring from home into their schoolwork. So
a lot of the times we forget that even when I went to my former school, one of the things that we learned was that heredity and the environment contributes to the holistic growth of an individual. So part of the environment is that environment at school. The heredity is at home, where the parents need to start that, need to jumpstart that wanting to go to school, that wanting to have that education, have that knowledge. I think it should start from there. One of the points that one of the representatives made also is that let's not just start at the secondary school level. Let's not start at the primary school level. Let's start beyond. Let's start, engaging our younglings in the bilingual art form, our Creole, our natural, what comes naturally for us. So I think that was an important aspect as well, because from my community of ancillary, we spoke Creole fluently. And as you can tell, I went to school and we did English, and I have the ability to switch from English into Creole and switch back. And it's something that's helped me a lot, not just in St. Lucia, because Creole is a language spoken on various Caribbean islands. So it's helped me a lot in understanding others, and even as close to as French as we can get. While in my community, I could say that I have an understanding of that. So definitely, it doesn't start at the primary school level. Let's not start at the secondary school level. Let's build them from young. Let's build them to understand. Let's build them to be, multi-talented, or have these multiple things that engage them, multiple engines that
for
can
sure.
drive them.
And as with Creole, we did see that many of the members did use the language, which I was very pleased about. Also, main point from this morning, I think one of the main distinctions that was brought up was the introduction of the Aptitude Test that we saw, and how I think both sides agreed that the common entrance is not a true reflection of aptitude. And so the main government brought up the aptitude test, and contrary to that, the opposition brought up the idea of continuous assessment in conjunction with examination. So that's one of the main areas of dispute, I suppose.
Well, you can only tell so much from an examination, especially one that has been told to students determines the footsteps in their lives. You can only say so much about a student by an examination.
Right.
But when you get into that student's mind, you get into that student's realm, you discover so much more from that child, from that individual, that you can explore. So I am for the abolition of the CXC examinations being looked at, that one piece of material that can lead you on.
All right, so in closing, I did just want to mention a few of the points that we spoke this morning about the restructuring. So just to touch on that again, we have now a I believe it's 9/11? No, sorry, it is 9/8? Yes, a 9/8 government, which actually is, it helps with to distinguish the National Youth Parliament from the main government, so that members don't feel that they need to live up to their senior counterparts. We thank you very much for joining our live broadcast, and I believe on behalf of the National Television Network, we'd all like to thank you and wish you all a happy 41st Independence celebration anniversary. Celebration. Once again, I'm Blossom Sylvester, and my co-host
Kendall Seraphim.
Yes, thank you very much for joining us.